As Iran and the United States reopen nuclear talks in Oman, both sides describe the first round as constructive. Yet military threats persist and Israeli pressure on Washington is intensifying. Iran insists on its right to enrich uranium, while the United States maintains sanctions and a growing military presence in the region. So, will diplomacy continue, or does the risk of a military strike still loom? Can Tehran and Washington find a compromise on uranium enrichment and sanctions? Did the U.S. eliminate the military option yet? And how will Israeli pressure shape U.S. decision making? I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. Welcome to In Depth. According to the New York Times, President Donald Trump has reverted to diplomacy with Iran, but the path to a deal remains narrow and uncertain. Recent talks in Oman were described as a good start by both sides, mainly because they avoided escalation. But major disagreements persist. Iran insists on its right to enrich uranium and refuses to negotiate its ballistic missile program, while U.S. negotiators have sought zero enrichment limits on missiles and an end to support for regional proxy groups. The report notes that Iran is experienced in prolonging negotiations and may be testing whether Trump seeks a quick diplomatic win rather than a prolonged regional conflict. Analysts warn that the buildup of U.S. forces and Israeli concerns over Iran's missile capabilities could shorten the diplomatic window. According to the Jerusalem Post, Israel remains uncertain about the United States' strategy towards Iran ahead of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's upcoming meeting with President Donald Trump in Washington. Israeli security officials say that recent discussions with U.S. envoys showed alignment on the Iranian threat and desired outcomes. But Washington's intentions remain unclear. Israel warns that limited U.S. action could embolden Tehran, allowing it to expand its regional influence through proxies and threaten neighbors' oil infrastructure. The report notes that Iran seeks to avoid capitulation while preserving core assets, adopting what Israeli officials describe as a bazaar-style negotiating strategy. Israel has set red lines on Iran's missile program and plans to stress these concerns during Netanyahu's talks with Trump amid uncertainty over the White House's final decision. And for more analysis, we're joined from Cairo by Dr. Mohammed Osman, International Relations Specialist, and from Washington by Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, Global Foreign Policy Center Executive Director. Welcome, gentlemen, to Q News. I would start with you, Dr. Osman. Now, Iran described the Oman talks as a very good start, while stressing that they will not negotiate the right to enrich uranium. How should this messaging be interpreted?
Thank you for having me, Hala. Always a pleasure to be with you. It seems that Iran is buying time, and the United States as well is probably buying time by this point and trying to create the necessary justification before any potential military action, meaning that both sides, the U.S. wants to demonstrate that it exhausted the diplomatic option before opting for any escalatory measure, and Iran is buying time, thinking that something miraculous might happen to pull it out of its predicament. The issue of enrichment, the United States, I believe, is open to the idea of making a deal with the Iranians, and I think they do prefer that by the Trump administration, a deal that is limited to the nuclear file. However, they will expect Iran to present very, very considerable and sizable concessions in this regard, including, of course, zero enrichment and the dismantlement of what is left of their enrichment facilities. Is this fair? Far from it. It's not fair. It violates Iran's sovereignty. But let's be realistic, Hala. This is what the Americans are willing to take as a deal. And they are willing to forego and postpone discussions around the missile program and the regional proxies. The Iranians, I believe, in my opinion, need to be more flexible. However, at the same time, they do face the danger of the domestic backlash. And it's also they're facing dangers and challenges due to the divisions inside the Iranian regime over this. The nuclear program has been the flagship national project of the country, and it provides Iran with strategic choices in the future should it be cornered. However, it is actually cornered now. And actually, the nuclear program, instead of it being one of the strategic assets of Iran, might be one of the strategic liabilities at this point. However, there are very sound-minded people within the Iranian regime who understand this in moderate circles. However, the Grand Ayatollah, Ali Khamenei, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, I think that they are far from being sensible about this, Hala.
Yes. Mr. Russell, thank you so much for joining us. Let me start by asking you, now, Trump has warned of military action while pursuing the talks. How does Washington balance threats and diplomacy at the same time? And what does this reveal about U.S. negotiating strategy?
Well, it's always good to be with you, Hala. Thanks for having me. Look, that's a very complex question. How do we balance the military saber rattling by putting a carrier battle group into the Arabian Gulf with traditional mediation and diplomatic tracks? We don't. That's not the MO. They can go back and forth. It's been going back and forth for months on this. The reality here is that it's a very awkward time for this relationship in the discussions between Tehran and Washington. As the good doctor there in Cairo pointed out, there's a lot of weakness. There's a lot of stress on the government. Peshkarian and the Ayatollah Khamenei are seeing, larger protests than we've seen before. We've seen this before in Iran, not to the scale, to add to the fact that these protests are based on economic stresses. Yes. There's no economy in Iran, and that poses a great deal of threat to the Iranian, at least the Islamic Republic stronghold on the country. What I'm getting at, Hala, is that right now, both sides could be painted into a corner. If Iran is painted into a corner and we get too aggressive and not diplomatic enough by pushing military assets closer and closer, they could react by, look, we all know that they don't have a ballistic missile program that could strike the U.S., but they can strike our presence in places like Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, etc. And they can definitely take a swipe at Israel again. That is very problematic for Donald Trump. It's also problematic because then the retaliation puts more stresses and a harder impact, not just on the national infrastructure, but on the economy in Tehran. Yes. It's bad news. We're almost getting to a mutually assured destruction point here just by not sitting at the table.
Dr. Osman, now some analysts say that the Muscat talks may have bought time rather than produced a deal. How valuable is this time in preventing escalation? And did the U.S. give up on the military option entirely or not really?
Look, if they do not come out with a workable agreement, war is going to happen. I do believe that. I do believe that this time the situation is very serious. Actually, like the rules of engagement between Israel and the United States on one side and Iran on the other have been shattered over the past 2 years after the October 7th attacks and the aftermath of all of this regionally, which eventually escalated into a confrontation between Israel and Iran in the 12-day war and a military intervention by the Americans in the so-called Operation Nighthammer, where they had bombed the enrichment facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. So the rules of engagement are are not there anymore. They have changed substantially, and this time bombing Iran is no longer a taboo, and the Iranian response, in a way, can be measured. Not necessarily contained, by the way. The United States would be doing a great miscalculation if they think that they, without a shadow of a doubt, will surely contain an Iranian response in terms of its scale and its impact on regional stability and the world economy even. So the problem is, Hala, is that they have to reach an agreement. And I do not think that the United States will be eager or ready to engage in a long negotiations, because these negotiations can take a very long time. Before they reached the 2015 agreement, nuclear agreement, Hala, do you know how long it took? It took them 2 years, about 15 or 16 rounds of negotiations. Some rounds, a single round can last up to 15 days. This is not going to happen anymore. I do not believe that the Americans are ready for this. And Trump knows that he has to settle this before the midterms, because if he loses the congressional majority in the midterms in any of the houses, he does not have a free hand in foreign policy anymore, and he knows it. And settling the Iran issue is one of the strategic objectives of the United States, foreign policy-wise.
Exactly. Mr. Russell, now Iran insisted that those negotiations should only address the nuclear program, not the missiles capabilities or any other point of contention. Is the U.S. willing to make a deal with Iran without addressing its other concerns?
I don't think that Iran's going to be able to make that call legitimately. Look, the U.S. is coming at this from a standpoint that the reason why we being the United States, taking an aggressive maneuver against Iran is because Iran poses a very capable and strategic threat to U.S. national security in the region and to our regional partners.
Yes.
Is the nuclear capability? Look, let's not be naive here. We already know that there's 800 pounds of enriched uranium floating around unchecked in Iran. Do we want that? No, that's even more of a risk to national security and the security of our regional partners. We need to address that. However, because of Iran's alleged proxy involvement with organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and some of the other proxies in places like northern Iraq and Iran, it has to be at least, I guess the word would be addressed a little bit. The ballistic missile capabilities, I don't think there's going to be a strong leg. I think, as long as they don't keep developing a ballistic missile capability.
There is room for negotiation in this case. There would be room for negotiation.
There is, but there's one caveat here, Hala, that we have to look at, is that it's, and again, the doctor pointed this out, is the internal politics of both Tehran, but most importantly, here in the United States.
Yes.
This is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is kind of playing the madman theory in foreign policy, kind of Richard Nixon way, but taking it to a whole new level. At some point, one's going to ask, are they either serious about sitting down and mediating this crisis, or is somebody going to call Trump's bluff, and that could cause the loss of innocent lives and pose an even greater national security threat to the United States and our allies?
Yes. Dr. Osman, now, Netanyahu is expected to discuss Iran with Trump. How could Israeli lobbying affect the trajectory of these negotiations, and what risks does that pose to regional stability?
Of course, it can have a very adverse effect on the negotiations. The negotiations are already struggling as they are. If you add Israel to the mix, definitely the United States will even, the United States position, negotiating position, will even probably be more hardened. As I said, the US is ready to accept a nuclear deal, an exclusively nuclear deal. However, the Israelis, of course, are not content with this. They want a deal, officially, they want a deal that includes limiting Iran's missile capabilities to 300 kilometers, which is laughable, by the way, and also for Iran to sever its relationship entirely with its regional proxies. I don't think that the United States knows that this is basically a no deal. That this can never be accomplished in any shape or form if the U.S. is interested in a diplomatic solution. And I believe they are invested in reaching one because they do know and they do understand the ramifications of a regional war with Iran. Because this time for Iran, the battle and the war, Hala, is existential. So they will basically do whatever it takes to survive and to respond to any attack whatsoever. The regime doesn't want to look weak domestically or regionally after suffering so many blows over the years. So the problem is Israel, of course, back to the Israel point, Hala, they will try to undermine these negotiations because the real agenda is not really a deal at all. It is to push the United States into this regional confrontation because Israel is the only party that believes that it can sustain the losses, and strategically on the long term, it has everything to gain by toppling the Iranian regime, even if this means that Iran, a huge pivot country in between the Middle East, wedged between the Middle East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Caspian Sea in this strategic region. If it descends into chaos, it will be a disaster for everyone, including the United States. But you know what, Hala, Israel doesn't really care about that. Yes. What they care about is their absolute securitized aims for the region, unfortunately. So I believe that this visit by Netanyahu is very concerning and could be very detrimental to the negotiations.
Yes, and I would like to further elaborate on the role of Israel in this regard with you, Mr. Russell. Now, Israeli officials, Mr. Russell, are reportedly urging the U.S. to take a harder line. How influential is Israel in shaping U.S.-Iran policy under the current administration of President Donald Trump?
There's definitely some influence there. However, I think it's not as much as we may have seen maybe a couple of years ago, or even as much as we've seen, after some of the events that have happened in the region. I guess what's happening here is that the White House is going to hear the concerns of Netanyahu when he visits this week. I think that they will take that into consideration. However, I think what's happening here is they don't want to see this. Again, this is a president that's been claiming he is the president of peace. He basically took a peace prize away from Ms. Machado, saying that he deserved it. Well, you know what you don't get is a Nobel Peace Prize by instigating regional conflict. And I gotta admit, I think there's another factor here, is that any expansion of hostilities that brings in Israel, I think, again, I go back to the idea that there is still a very capable military force inside Iran that is close proximity to Israel. I'm not sure the Israeli people want to get this hyper-aggressive and this engaged because they know it will bring hardship on themselves.
Then why are they insisting on hitting Iran? Why are they pushing Trump so hard to hit Iran?
Oh, Hala, please! You know this as well as I do. You and I have talked about this many times. This is in part Benjamin Netanyahu's ability to maintain power. He's still there. He's still staring down a court case. He doesn't want to give up that power. He wants the love of the right wing in Israel. This is part of this is jazz hands diplomacy to keep him and the AU party in power.
Yes, I believe we discussed this when we were talking about Gaza and the implementation of the second phase. Yes. I remember you told me he's doing this just to stay in power, right?
Yeah, yes. We've talked about this many times on this network. But again, I think that there are added stresses and added mitigation. Remember, the White House also understands that Saudi Arabia and other regional partners have said, if you do use military assets to attack Iran, you won't be doing it through our airspace. You take Saudi out of the picture. I believe the Emirates have said the same thing. They're sitting there going, yeah, that takes you way out of operational and strategic advantage.
Yes.
So, again, I think to your question, Bibi Netanyahu has some pull here in Washington. I don't think it's going to be that much because Donald Trump wants to see the win. He'd rather see a diplomatic win than a military win.
Yes. Dr. Osman, reports indicate that Israeli pressure on Washington regarding a potential agreement with Iran, especially given the upcoming Netanyahu visit to the U.S. How does this pressure complicate U.S.-Iran diplomacy, and what regional consequences could follow if negotiations collapse, building on what just Mr. Russell told us?
Yeah, let me just begin with building on what my colleague has said in the United States, and that is the Israeli public, even though they're not universally for war against Iran. However, the latest polls do show that about 46% of Israelis do support a regime change war against Iran. So that's a sizable portion of the population. However, the political class, the security establishment, the military establishment, they have a consensus that Iran should be toppled, that Iran should be destroyed, that their missile capabilities and their nuclear program has to be completely neutralized, and the relationship, of course, with the regional proxies has to be severed. This is not something that is a Netanyahu thing. This is an Israel thing, and we have to understand that very well, and that even makes it more serious and dangerous, Hala. If that serves Netanyahu's purpose to stay in power, yes, it does, of course. However, I don't think that he's even strong enough to lead an entire country towards the abyss just to stay in power. This is about what Israel really wants as an establishment and as a country and as a nation. Unfortunately, and it saddens me to say this.
Yes.
And also, of course, by nature, by virtue of what I just said, definitely the Israeli position might very well compromise the United States negotiating position. However, as Mr. Russell rightly pointed out, there are limitations to that. The United States now leads a much more independent-minded foreign policy. And when the United States wanted to enforce its will on the Israelis under the Trump administration, by the way, more than any other administration, even though it's quite ironic because Trump is one of the staunchest Zionist sympathizers and one of the staunchest supporters of Israel. And on the other hand, he's the only president who actually managed to push the Israelis and force them to end the war in Gaza, for example. No matter how distorted the outcome may be, it is definitely better than the carnage continuing at the pace it was happening during the war in Gaza. He stopped the Iran-Israel war, the 12-day war. He even, if you remember, he posted on social media threatening Netanyahu that he should recall the fighter jets immediately so that Israel wouldn't get the final strike against Iran at the end of their exchange.
Yes.
So the United States does know how to impose its will, and I do not think it will compromise its interests for the sake of the Israelis. So I think that Netanyahu's endeavors are limited. However, what can actually support Netanyahu's sinister agenda, in my opinion, is Iranian lack of flexibility. I'm speaking from a very realistic standpoint and not from a moral standpoint. From a moral standpoint, I'm completely against what the United States is doing. This is meddling in the affairs of a sovereign nation. However, if we are being realists about this, the Iranians have to be much more flexible and smart in their negotiations and take advantage of the opportunity that is presented by this last-minute, last-chance negotiation, in my opinion.
Indeed, indeed. Mr. Russell, a failed deal could lead to military escalation, as President Donald Trump warned already. So from a U.S. perspective, what would trigger a strike, and how close are we to that threshold? Would it be the lack of flexibility on the Iranian side, as Dr. Osman pointed out, or there are other factors?
Well, that's a very good question, Hala, and I don't think we're keenly aware as to what might be the trigger point that would start military operation against Iran. It's delicate, and again, we're dealing with a very unknown quantity when we're dealing with Donald Trump in this situation.
True.
Look, the bottom line here is this has an opportunity. I just want to kind of dovetail on to what my colleague, the good doctor there in Cairo, was talking about. Look, there's an opportunity here to fix this. There's an opportunity here. You're talking about a president that loves seeing his name on something, and there's been rumors floating around that they're just going to redo the JCPOA and call it the Trump agreement, and that would make everybody satisfied. As part of any agreement, any agreement would probably allow Iran to start, although gradually, integrating back into the global economic community. What does Iran need right now? Economic stimulus. You've got a just destroyed economy, and the other parties involved in this that we haven't talked about, China and Russia, who say that, hey, Tehran, we've got your back, haven't really come to the table to say we got your back. And bringing Iran back into the economic community will help stabilize some of the tensions inside the country, because when people are fed, when people have economic growth, when they have economic security, they tend not to want to overthrow a government through wide mass protests like we've seen in the western part of the country.
Yes.
So I think that this is, if Trump and Witkoff and Kushner come to the table and they look at it as a business deal, I think we'll start seeing some progress, and that will stave off disaster. It's when we become closed-minded and there is no flexibility, is when we start getting into the threats of armed conflict.
Yes. Dr. Osman, let's talk more about Iran and its flexibility here, because Iran insists on its right to enrichment, but signals readiness for nuclear-focused talks. Is there a realistic compromise formula that preserves enrichment while addressing Western non-proliferation concerns?
There could be an agreement, theoretically, of course, like the 2015 agreement, for example, that my colleague was just referring to. It did stipulate just that. It put certain limitations on Iran's ability to enrich uranium, not above 3.6, if I'm not mistaken, percent enrichment rate. So these are things that can be managed. However, is the United States ready to accept anything less than zero enrichment? The problem is, so far we have not seen any indicators that this might be the case. However, if the Iranians are smart, and as my colleague just said, if they know how to appeal to Mr. Trump's ego, and if they do know how to market a new agreement that could be very similar to the 2015 agreement, just with a little more caveats here and there, a little more constraints as well here and there on the Iranians, a few more Iranian concessions, and at the same time giving President Trump credit as a peacemaker. This is how he likes to be portrayed. This might actually also give Trump an off-ramp that he can use.
This is the optimum situation here, Dr. Osman. Do you expect it to happen?
Which likely it's not going to happen, unfortunately, because because the Iranians, instead of doing that, they're calling Trump names. And they're calling him that great Satan and whatever. And the supreme leader said that he would never speak to him. He shuns him at every point. He said that they say we will not ever negotiate directly with the Americans. This would be indirect negotiations. The Americans this, the Americans that. The Iranian officials on a daily basis bashing President Trump and the United States.
Yes.
With someone with the temperament of President Trump, this doesn't help.
Yes.
We've seen what happened with Venezuela. Of course, he did not take out Nicolas Maduro because he taunted him dancing, but it was a factor, definitely.
Yes.
So if you give Trump the impression, and the United States, because Trump in a way embodies the United States in foreign policy as this big leader of this huge powerful country, this superpower. If you show and express overtly disrespect to a superpower, this undermines its credibility and its authority, and it might be forced to act. So the Iranians, I believe, need to be much more mature about this, need to be much more level-headed about this, and be more realistic about their expectations of the outcomes of these negotiations.
Yes. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I'd like to thank my dear guest today, Dr. Muhammad Osman, International Relations Specialist, and Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, Global Foreign Policy Center Executive Director. Thank you, gentlemen, for your valuable insights and informative discussion. And this brings us to the end of today's episode for In Depth. My name is Halal Hamalawi. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for more updates and analysis here on Q News.